Despite the fact that scores of Palestinians have been killed in this supposed ceasefire, it appears that this Trump-brokered armistice, if you will, is holding. We've had to deal with many Israeli shenanigans over the past 2-3 weeks almost now. From symbolic bills being passed in the Knesset to annexing the West Bank, to threatening to annihilate Gaza, even more so if the bodies of the Israeli captives, hostages, were not returned. But despite all of this, it seems that this ceasefire is holding. Of course, an indication towards this, that maybe, this time around, unlike the January ceasefire, that the present situation may hold, is that Israel has agreed to allow both foreign and local journalists into Gaza itself. This is, of course, a first. Ever since October the 7th, the only journalists reporting on the ground were Palestinians who have been killed in their droves. More than 200 plus, I think the number is somewhere at about 235, journalists reporting for international organizations such as Al Jazeera, Reuters, have been killed, have been specifically targeted by Israel, with nary a word from the supporters of Zionism, from the stalwarts of Western media, BBC, CNN, New York Times. So for the longest time, for the 2 years, the coverage that we did get on the ground was from either Palestinian journalists or, of course, Palestinian civilians who, thanks to the internet and, of course, smartphones and various other devices, were able to broadcast in 4K, as it's now come to be known, the genocide. But this is the first time since the start of this genocide that foreign journalists are being allowed into the Gaza Strip. This is not to say that foreign individuals, suspect individuals, influencers, military advisors, even I would say a handful of selected, cherry-picked journalists were allowed into Gaza. We all remember the fiasco that was American influencers, largely American influencers, going to the GHF, and please, I'm putting this in air quotes, relief sites, and showing the world how much aid there was, while of course a famine was ongoing in Gaza itself. We saw many military advisors. We saw, I think, a handful of journalists embedded with the IDF, being given, of course, the grand tour. Well, not, of course, to the parts where the ethnic cleansing and the genocide was taking part, but at least almost to the outskirts of Gaza itself. But now, according to Israel, they are going to allow foreign journalists, as well as local ones, within the buffer zone, if you will. I mean, sort of that yellow cordon, that yellow sort of demarcation that they have, separating the Palestinians, or at least who is even running that part of the Gaza Strip? Hamas? I mean, they were hell-bent on dethroning them, and yet Hamas still remains. But again, that's something for another day. So at least in the Israeli-administered part of Gaza, or occupied part of Gaza, journalists will be allowed in. Of course, if you all remember, this is something that Piers Morgan, for example, on his show was clamoring, especially during the famine itself, especially after the January ceasefire was violated by Israel. Many journalists, Piers Morgan again is an example, were calling upon Israel to allow foreign journalists in, allow them to assess the situation for themselves independently. Of course, Israel would always throw up the excuse that it is not safe for them, it is not safe for these journalists, and of course, the rebuttal to that would be that journalists in many conflicts before this one, were in war zones. And of course, their safety was, of course, their own responsibility. Israel, of course, didn't allow them in for obvious reasons. They did not want the world to see what they had done, the evil that they had brought upon the Palestinians. They didn't want anyone to see that. Of course, them to assume that the Palestinians, for example, were not already broadcasting through social media what was going on the ground, brings to question Israel's intelligence, Israel's strategy, Israel's approach in this PR media war that was going on. Now, of course, another front is opening up in this PR war, because Israel has been obsessed with its own image over the past 2 years. On the one hand, they wish to commit atrocities, they wish to commit a genocide, they wish to enact ethnic cleansing, but on the other, they wish to broadcast to the world, to convince them that they are not the evil ones. They are not the Nazis inherit. They are somehow waging a righteous war, and if you believe otherwise, you have bought into Hamas and Qatari propaganda. Of course, this is a point that I have raised before on this very show. But it seems that the scripts that Israel keeps on writing are lacking, perhaps, that creativity, are lacking the Hollywood touch. Because again, if it is to be believed that Western media, American media, Hollywood, are sort of controlled by Zionists and the Jews, I'm surprised why they haven't put any of those people in their employ. Because so far, Israel has done a piss-poor job at trying to woo the public. I mean, their charm offensive has failed. While in the initial days after October 7th, I would say maybe perhaps the first couple of months, sympathy, worldwide sympathy, was with Israel. Because again, to Western eyes and ears, it was an unprovoked attack. Beheaded babies, women being raped en masse, civilians caught in the crossfire, and of course, the hostages, captives themselves. But slowly, as the world woke up and smelt that coffee and started to see what Israel was doing in Gaza, that's when the tide turned. That's when opinion started to change. And now, after 2 years of unending atrocities, we are now at this point where Israel is desperate. They are grasping at straws. They feel that they are, of course, on the losing side, both militarily, diplomatically, but also, of course, now in the media. I don't want to quote polls and figures as to how much the American public, for example, have turned against Israel. But, I mean, when you have such desperate acts as trying to convince the American public, and of course the wider world, that starving Gazan children are somehow a Hamas propaganda ploy, you know that the Israelis have lost the plot. Now, of course, they are in yet another crisis. They're in crisis mode because allowing these journalists in, no matter how sympathetic they may be, because of course one doubts very much if Israel is going to allow maybe pro-Palestinian or even neutral journalists into the Strip. So, I mean, they're going to be handpicking them again. But one doubts very much that these journalists are not going to report what is actually on the ground. And on the ground is, of course, utter devastation. That moonscape, the rubble-laden erasure of a people. If you remember, when those aid drops were happening during the height of the famine, many journalists were allowed onto those military cargo planes, but they were strictly instructed by the IDF soldiers who I think were on board those planes not to shoot from out of, not to shoot any, what's it called, the strip itself, not to shoot Gaza itself, not to capture it on camera. Of course they did. And it was resounding. I mean, across the board, every single journalist was awestruck by what they saw. Jared Kushner, Donald Trump's, the US president's son-in-law, who was apparently an architect of this recent ceasefire, and I would say no friend of Palestine. Even he, in his recent tour along with Steve Witkoff, said it was like a nuclear bomb had gone off. So to somehow, because now, and I will get to what I was about to read in a second, for Israel to somehow dress this up in a way to show these journalists that, look, we didn't do any of this, this was Hamas, is going to require the kind of media spin, if they are of course successful, that we've never seen before. It's like the Nazis taking in journalists to the concentration camps and somehow saying that this was not our doing, because that is exactly what Israel is attempting, or at least will attempt to do when they bring in these journalists. Netanyahu recently, as well as many senior officials, both the Foreign Office, what's it called, coordinators with media, so on and so forth, have all said that officials, and I'm reading here from Dropsite News, officials have held strategy meetings to prepare for what they describe as a coming wave of anti-Israel reporting. To this end, what Israel is planning to do, besides, of course, covering up the evidence, which I think is going to be nigh impossible, because you can literally see it from space. The effort includes creating demonstration sites, in quotation marks, to show how Hamas allegedly operated within civilian areas and show signs of Hamas in homes, schools, and hospitals, thus justifying leveling these residential areas. To give further weight to the human shields narrative, to further paint Hamas in this light of being terrorists and running a terrorist state. A senior official said, "The IDF and military intelligence are working hard to gather incriminating material needed to support this message, that is, to frame the destruction as Hamas's responsibility." Another senior official explained, "We especially need visual evidence. When we take journalists on tours, we must explain what happened." Of course, this is akin to that comedy show that we saw when Israelis stormed, I think this was the Al-Shifa hospital I think this is the first year of the genocide. And they said, look, there's a hole in the ground. This clearly leads to a Hamas tunnel/cave system. Of course, completely and utterly disproved. The campaign also aims to contest Gaza's death toll, with Israeli officials preparing data to argue that many reported civilian deaths were unrelated to Israel attacks. How they are going to pull this rabbit out of their hat is anyone's guess. Who then killed, murdered, maimed more than 100,000 people? And of course, that is the most conservative estimates right now. Even by Israel's own admission, where they were saying that it was 1 to 3 was the ratio. 3 to 1, I think, was the ratio, where it was 3 civilians for every Hamas fighter killed. So even by that, or was it, I think, 2 to 1, I'm forgetting right now. But even by that estimation, if you have 30,000, according to them, Hamas fighters killed, this means that anywhere up to 60 to 90,000 people, civilians, including that 30,000, this means about at least 60,000 civilians have been killed. So that means, on average, that rounds up to at least 100,000. But of course, the figures that have been presented by the Gaza Health Ministry only account for those whose bodies have been recovered. We're not talking about all of those interred, buried in the rubble. This number is going to go higher. So, of course, they're going to try and contest this and then joke of all jokes to argue that many reported civilian deaths were unrelated to Israeli attacks. How then did these people die? Was it Hamas who, on the one hand, was fighting the occupation and on the other hand going and mowing down civilians? No, that was the collaborators' job. The Abu, I think, I'm forgetting the name of that particular gang that was working along with, collaborating with the Israelis. They, within, I think, days of the ceasefire, went out and started killing people. I think 20 or 25 people were killed. Some insiders doubt Israel can shape global coverage, saying the devastation is already well documented. Of course it is. The amount of footage, pictures that we have seen from over the past 2 years, I can't put a number to it, but there is no way that any attempt by Israel can somehow gloss over or erase that footage, those images from our minds. There's no way that Israel can do that. According to that very same official, this is the aftershock, like a tsunami. We just have to lower our heads, let the wave pass, and move on. Of course, for Israelis, for Zionists, it is easy to say. It is easy to say that we will weather this storm, that the atrocities, the war crimes that we have committed in Gaza will somehow be forgotten. And this is now a time to consolidate. This is now a time, not for self-reflection, of course. To expect that from the Israelis would almost be a miracle. But this is now a time for this bloodthirsty nation, this murderous nation, to ignore or somehow tune out all of the bad press. And in his words, move on. Of course, that is not the. I'm looking forward to see what Israel at least tries to do. In at least, I don't know. I think they're going to build model homes or whatnot. I can't even imagine. They're going to somehow try and reconstruct what they have demolished, what they have destroyed, and show the Hamas tunnels. So, I'm looking forward to actually see this coverage from foreign journalists. But it seems that Israel is still not done. I'm not going to say it's a change in strategies or that they are shifting gears. But at least over the past week, I've been seeing an increasing amount of course, Zionists and Zionist chills furthering propaganda, furthering, of course, that Israeli, furthering the official narrative. But I find it interesting that they're somehow or the other trying to target Qatar in this. Qatar, who, as we all know, has been playing an integral role in brokering, in brokering a ceasefire, in allowing for the two warring parties to negotiate over the past 2 years, and of course, years before as well. Qatar itself was a target of Israeli belligerents when Hamas figures were attacked in Doha by the Israelis. And recently, at least in two discussions, one a podcast and the other a panel discussion, Laura Loomer, of course, famous for letting an Israeli pedophile go scot-free from America, and of course, not my words, I am Blakely's words, what's it called, Jigsaw lookalike, and Emily Austin of Hot Girls for Cuomo fame. They were recently spouting Zionist propaganda that the Qataris, it is Qatar who is apparently spending far more than Israel ever has on Hamas propaganda, on getting the American public to turn on Israel. Of course, Anna Kasparian, very good at what she does, was very quick to refute and rebut and rubbish the argument. But it's interesting to see that at least the notes that have been passed to these Zionists from their handlers, who may or may not be getting $7,000 per post, is now somehow or the other redirecting the ire towards Qatar. This after, of course, Trump forced Netanyahu to apologize to Qatar. And we all saw that picture. But again, I think this is just another attempt, a Zionist attempt at deflection, another attempt at Zionists and Israel to target or at least have another persons to hate, because a country like that runs off of it. It needs someone to hate. It needs an enemy. Because otherwise it has perhaps no reason to continue. What happens when Israel stops hating? If you ask a Zionist, they say it'll be the end for Israel. Because for them, ever since its inception, Israel, maybe spurred by the trauma of the Holocaust, has felt that in order to exist, it must always keep itself, its society, in this state of fear. That the barbarians are always at the gate, and even a single slip up from us, even a momentary lapse on our part will lead to our destruction.
The revolution will be live.